Well, hello and welcome to Red Flags Early Warning Signs of Workplace Violence. While the topic is heavy, our goal is to talk about it in an open environment where you leave here with more knowledge and some practical takeaways that apply to your industry and so that you can better protect yourself and also your colleagues and coworkers that are there. So in case we haven't met, my name is Holly Foxworth and I am a registered nurse and the marketing manager for content here at Axiom. And I am joined by two individuals that you will meet shortly. One is the Director of Behavioral Health, and that is Sarah Hathaway. And then we also have our Chief Marketing Officer, Dara. But before we get started with all of that, let's get you acquainted with what you're looking at here, what your surroundings are. On the upper right-hand side of your screen, that's where you're going to see there's a blue RSVP button. And so that's going to get you your admission to one of our biggest webinars of the year that's coming up next month. The topic, I'm sure you can guess what it is, marijuana, but we've invited the team from Hound Labs to join us for that event. And so we're going to talk through the policy and practice, adapting to new cannabis norms in the workplace. We're going to go through, the panel will go through why it is that we have such a 20-year high of THC positive tests. We'll go through talking about the change, the recommended change that made, discussed this last week with the FDA, with changing that from a Schedule 3 to a Schedule 1. We will go through some of the policies that other organizations are making, the changes that they are making there to adapt to some of the law changes that have taken place, and then also go through somehow the technology that's impacting this. So their organization in particular does the breath testing, so it's recent use testing, and what you'll see is that there's a shift in that direction where you're going away from the traditional testing mechanisms and methods there and going to a new modern approach. And so that's what we're going to be talking through then. So there's going to be lots of great information. You don't want to miss that one. And to get you registered for that, you just have to press that button. It'll get you registered. You don't have to enter any additional information. We'll just send you a confirmation, and we look forward to seeing you then the next month. Now, in addition to that, we are recording this. We'll have it available within 24 hours. You'll see that there's also a copy of the slide deck and some resources that are there as well if you'd like to download those. One thing I would like to ask your help in today is interacting with us and sharing how you feel. So there are some questions that as we go through this, if there's something that really jumps out at you, if there's something that really sticks out, we want you to use those buttons that are at the bottom. There's some that have emojis on there. And so you can use the thumbs up, you can use the heart, whatever it is that you need to use. But that tells us not only that that makes sense to you, that it resonates with you, but it also, we use that to create clips to share with other people within your organization, other people on social media, et cetera, to give them kind of small bits of what made sense to you. So if you'll utilize those, we would appreciate that. The other piece that I love the most is the Q&A box. And so that's the first place that I go to whenever I'm looking at who it is that I want to send special gifts to after some of these events. So if you have any types of questions, oh, I saw thumbs up. Thank you. I appreciate that. You guys are already on it today. So if you will put your questions there in the Q&A box, any type of stories that you have, if you have a workplace violence story, if you have something that you'd like to share with the group, and even if you want to do it anonymously, I have no problem, not including your name, just let us know. But share those with us, because hearing your stories and hearing what's going on your side really helps not only us, but also everybody else that's on this event today. So with that being said, let's go ahead and meet some of our presenters. So Dara, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Sarah next.
Great, thank you, Holly. Before I introduce myself, I know we're getting a lot of feedback that the button for the register for the cannabis webinar isn't working. So we'll make sure that all of you that are attending get the link to register for the cannabis webinar. And thank you for letting us know that that button's not working. And we apologize for the inconvenience. My name is Dara Wheeler, and I'm Axiom's Chief Marketing Officer and over product. And I've been with Axiom for 18 years, I believe. It's hard to keep track sometimes. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic today. Like Holly said, it's a tough topic, but an important one. And I know some of you have already started sending in stories and questions. So please keep that up, because we want to make this very interactive with all of you. And I'm really excited on another note too. Usually we have some of our doctors here. Usually we have Dr. Kurte or Dr. Cherry, And we've got ladies representing today. So we've got Sarah, and I'll let Sarah introduce herself right now.
Thank you, Dara. Nice to speak with you all. I'm Sarah Hathaway. I'm the Director of Behavioral Health here at Axiom. I have been with Axiom only for about 1.5 years, but I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I have been in the field for about 14 years now, primarily working in workplace mental health and with a lot of experience in critical incident response.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for joining us today. It's going to be a fantastic event. We're going to start things off with the first poll question of the day. We've got several of these, but the first one is, have you or somebody else that you know, have either of you ever experienced a form of workplace violence? So the answers there that you have to choose from are, yes, I personally have. Yes, I know somebody that has, or no, I've never experienced that, or know someone that has. So go ahead and put in your answers there, and we're going to take a closer look, and I have a feeling we may be surprised when we look at the results there. But as we look at what we're going to go through today, there's several things that we want to focus on. So we'll go through, obviously, kind of what workplace violence is, but we want to talk about what the risk factors are, what those vulnerable groups are. We want to talk about how it is that you can identify those red flags early. There's nothing worse than when you look back at something, you think, oh man, we missed it. You know, there was signs there and we missed it all along. So we're going to go through what those red flags are. We're going to talk about the employee perspective, because that's huge right now. There was actually a report that came out this last week, and we'll go into it in more detail, but it specifically surveyed all of the employees and got their perspective on how they feel about workplace violence, some of the things that they've experienced personally. And so that the insight that they provide is amazing. And then the last part, we're actually going to go through a real life case study. I'm not going to tell you which one it is yet, but there's a case study that has to do with workplace violence. I will tell you that the outcome, obviously, there were some fatalities that were associated with that. But in addition to the fatalities, there was a component there of that the employer was faced with a $50 million litigation suit that had came from that. So we want to go through what those are. And by including that at the end, our hope is as we go through that case study, you'll be able to identify some of those red flag behaviors that existed that we now know, and that you would be able to identify those in your workplaces as well. So let's get started. Dara, I'm going to come to you first and let you start with what workplace violence actually is.
Yeah, and I think this is an important conversation to define, because I think when we hear violence, we think of physical violence, and we think of those acts or threats of either physical violence, harassment, intimidation, but that kind of physical threat of harm or disruptive behavior in a work site. But it also can be a little bit more broad than that. So we'll talk a little bit about that piece, but I also, the part about harassment and intimidation, that might not be you physically getting harmed, but there's this prevention of you being able to feel comfortable in your workplace and be able to perform the job you're being tasked with. I think that I know that employers are having to manage and address this more than they ever have before. And it's become a part of the component of good safety plans. And we'll talk a little about what that looks like for states and for various safety plans for our safety teams out there. But the way that violence and workplace violence can show up, it can be those physical threats, but it also can be verbal abuse, even homicide. We know that's kind of the worst case scenario, but all of these affect the ability of somebody to do their job well in the workplace. And it can be employees, clients, it could be customers, visitors, the public, it could be all different from different sources. And so it's not just employee on employee violence or, somebody creating this act of violence, but it could be the customers you're serving, or we're hearing from some of our audience, some of their specific customers they're serving or populations they're serving and how they're dealing with that. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like and the trends that we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about, before we get to the answers, I was thinking back to, just being in the hospital, Dara, of working in the ER and, being subjected to violence as well. And I'm sure that you guys have some of those same stories that you can relate to. But, just that, I remember one time in particular we had someone that they were on substances. They came in and just really punched me in the, in the face. It went to the jaw, and it was just such a shocking event that had occurred. But it's one of those things that you don't think that that's going to be occurring to you before you come into the workplace that day, but it can. It absolutely can. So you have to be on guard for those particular things. All right, so we've got our results from our first poll, and so it looks like that we have had some that have personally experienced this. Thank you for sharing that, and I would encourage you that if you have a story that you want to share with us that relates to that, we would love to share that with the group as well. About half have said that they've at least known someone that has experienced that, and then there's some that haven't, thankfully, been subjected to that. Is that surprising to you, Dara?
Yeah, a little bit. I think the fact that there's 32% of you or 33% of you that don't know somebody or personally haven't experienced that, I'm actually a little surprised by that. It feels more widespread, but maybe and we'll talk a little bit about the numbers and what they look like. And I think that's the problem, is when we think about violence, we're thinking about that physical harm. And so the definition is more broad than that. So maybe there's a lot of us that experience some of these scenarios that we wouldn't even necessarily consider as workplace violence. So we'll have to dig into that a little bit.
Absolutely. I did see in the chat that there was someone that was bringing up the issue of bullying, and absolutely, that is a piece that falls right in there with threats and things of that nature. So bullying absolutely would be included in some of those pieces when you're talking about what that is. Let's talk about some of the numbers then that you were explaining, Dara.
Yeah, and I just want to note here that we're up to 2022, 2023 numbers haven't fully been released yet. And I also want to point out that as a percentage of our population, these numbers might not actually feel that big when you look at how many people we've got in the United States, and this as a percentage of that population is a very, very small percent. And so when you look at the risk and you look at how we handle that risk, this is homicide specifically, so this is fatalities. And it might seem like a low percentage, but those numbers are trending up. And so although it might actually be a low percentage of our population, there's enough here to be concerning that especially with that trend going in a direction that it's a positive direction, but not a positive direction. So we want to make sure that we know how to prevent any of these fatalities from occurring, and how to, as employers, support our employees, not just to prevent a fatality, to prevent any of these workplace violence incidents. And the bullying point is a great one too. One of the things that we talk a lot about in the work we do is psychological safety, because safety in general is a broad term to help keep employees safe in the workplace. But if we miss the pieces around not just physical safety, but psychological safety, then I think we're missing a trick here. And I think it's also, as this duality of mind body has changed and we have stopped talking about them as separate things, the risk to employees from either is pretty high and pretty significant. So these are from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So that's our source here. And these are just the fatalities. Non-fatal injuries resulting from intentional injury were huge in the last few years as well. So while the fatalities in 2022 was about a little over 500, the actual non-fatal injuries is in the thousands of situations that occur. So in 2020, it was over 37,000 non-fatal injuries through workplace violence. So that's a pretty staggering number. And just like we even saw with our poll numbers, there might be a lot of people that either don't think of it as workplace violence or don't report it. How many know of unreported situations that are occurring in the workplace? And we haven't seen yet what last year's numbers hold. So I think we're going to have to hold judgment on that and make sure that we are paying attention to this as employers and our team members, just to make sure that that this is a trend that we could help mitigate and try to push the other direction.
Yeah. I noticed that that Robert Sharp had mentioned that he had mentioned an incident that he had been involved in. He said he had asked a welder to stop welding because he didn't have the right PPE, and then or a shield, and then the employee actually snapped. He punched him and actually broke his nose. Robert, I'm so sorry that that happened to you, but I appreciate you sharing that with us because that's exactly what we're talking about today. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's talk about who was actually impacted by this.
Yeah, well, Holly just talked about one key role, our amazing nurse teams out there working in healthcare, and Sarah's background in social work too. You know, those are two really, really vulnerable populations. I think we even had somebody in the chat talk about the work they do in social work and the risks there. Public facing roles, these are employees that are working with the public, customer service, public transportation, law enforcement would fall under some of this. They have a huge amount of incidents of workplace violence. Healthcare and social workers, they are often dealing with really difficult populations. This is why they go into their careers, of course. They want to help and they want to support some of these critical populations, but it is not easy work, and there is a high risk of injury and violence for those populations. People who work late night and in isolated scenarios, when you think about people working late night drive-throughs or convenience stores, they are at a really high risk of either witnessing or seeing or being recipients of violence in the workplace. High stress, emergency departments, psychiatric facilities, occupations with authoritative roles, people that are resistant to that authority and trying to kind of push back against it. I've known people that have dealt with, and as bank tellers, people managing money. And that is, I originally remember as a child hearing some stories from a family friend that was a bank teller, and she ended up on leave extended periods of time because she'd gone through so many bank robberies that she couldn't work anymore because of the trauma of going through repeated bank robberies and being, having a gun held on her and different things like that. And I just remember kind of being surprised, as a kid, I didn't think about that being a risky place. You're just going into a bank with your parent and hanging out and grabbing some cash, and then you don't realize how risky those roles are, and you think it's just a bank teller, but how they have to deal with those scenarios. And then workers who previously experienced workplace violence may have an increased risk, and that might be some of the issues around some unresolved trauma that they're dealing with in those violent encounters. So especially if they feel like those risks have been unresolved, or those scenarios have been unresolved. So it's these are a lot of different groups that I know we work with. I know a lot of you out there are managing teams that are dealing with some of these risky scenarios. And so it looks like we've had a lot of comments about how people are dealing with this and these different roles and populations. So I know Holly will talk a lot about this in the coming minutes.
Yeah, looks like we've had some great input here. Jeff had mentioned that he's in pest control and that he actually had a gun pulled on him. Jeff, I cannot imagine having that type of event occur. I was thinking about this morning too, Dara, on the news, they were talking about on the flight, I think there was one that was coming from Tokyo, and that, the flight attendant, that she was bit, and it's like, you think about these types of things, you think about using some of the Uber drivers. I mean, these are some really scary situations where it's like you're thinking, how is it that you manage this? How do you go from there once some of those things occur?
Yeah, as you said that, I've heard other stories. People that would think would be so innocuous, a cable installer, a satellite installer, dish network installer, and attacked by dogs. It's always it's fine, my dog's nice, until the dog comes around the corner and attacks. So I think it's often that's why I was a little surprised when we had 30% plus of our audience that hadn't heard or known somebody that had been in a situation. And I think often we hear these stories and they seem so extreme, but they could be as simple as a dog running at an employee who's having to now deal with a dog bite. And we have clients that are meter readers and do a lot of field work home to home, and they have a very high incidence of dog bites and other types of bites, which you don't think of as violence. It's not human on human violence, but I'm sorry, dealing with a dog bite must not be all that fun either.
Right, right, absolutely. Sarah, we're going to come to you next. We're going to do a poll first. And so first we'll ask you then, what type of behaviors do you think are most indicative of potential workplace violence? And I'll give you a little hint. You can select more than one on these. And Sarah had actually called me before the event and she said, hey, which is the right answer here? I'm thinking it's all of them. I said, you're exactly right. Oh, I just gave away the answer. Oh, great. Well, there you go. All right. Well, Sarah,
well, now everybody knows the right answer. That's all right.
Yeah, talk us through what some of the characteristics then of what an attack would be.
Sure. So this is where we kind of get into how does violent events build up to the event that occurs. So there's a few things that really kind of come together, four in particular, that come together to bring about violence in the workplace. The first is those conditioning factors. Conditioning factors are those things that help a person justify that violence is appropriate or effective to achieving an intended goal. So it could be a person's low self-esteem, it could be financial stress, maybe conflicts that they're having either at home or in the workplace, difficulty with others, interacting with others or building relationships. It might be that, consistent exposure to violence throughout a lifetime, or even things like familiarity with weapons. The second is the assailant or perpetrator's perception of the situation. So if this person believes that they've been wronged by someone, they have anger or resentment toward an individual or a group, their employer, if they're a customer, anger toward, the employee on the other side of the cash register, or in the case of, Holly, that patient who's frustrated and angry, upset, and takes it out on the nurse. These are those perceptions that can kind of build that thinking and drive toward violence. But one of the other critical things that really plays a factor in here is the environment in which those perceptions and risk factors occur. If the environment is one that tackles and has plans for mitigating violence and addressing concerns when they arise, that's going to really squash a lot of opportunity here. So when we talk about enabling environments, we're talking about things where concerns go unreported or unaddressed, maybe reported, but there's no consequence for poor behavior, problematic issues in the workplace. Enabling environments really just have insufficient measures for mitigating or stopping a violent event from occurring. Now you see in the middle there is that triggering event. So when all of these three things come together, all it really takes is just one event to shift the course into a violent act. And so triggering events or triggering factors oftentimes are things that the rest of us don't even recognize as triggering events. It could be the driver that cut somebody off on the way to work, or a coworker making an offhand comment. It could be just something so small when someone has already kind of built up. It's more of a, straw that broke the camel's back kind of situation.
Sarah, talk us through then, what are those red flags that we talk about?
Yeah. So we're really looking at 8 different behaviors, and these are outlined by Dr. Lynn McClure in her book, Risky Business, Managing Employee Violence. And these are really behaviors that many of us see every day, but they occur as a pattern. So as I go through each of these, we're really thinking about these as early warning signs. So actor behaviors are, when someone's making a big show of their anger. They might be yelling, slamming doors, stomping their fist on the table, stomping their feet. Anger is just a big explosive event. Fragmentary behaviors are those that create division within a company, within a team or group. So this is sometimes a little bit more under the table. So gossiping or spreading rumors. It could be pitting people against each other, really just kind of creating that disruption between people and creating a lot of separation, conflict. There are those me first behaviors where the person puts their own needs first. My needs are more important than yours. And if the rules don't serve me, then they don't apply to me. So that, any bit of inconvenience it can be a problem for that individual. Mixed message behaviors are when the things that people say and do just don't match up. So if somebody says, I'm really a team player, but then we see that they're refusing to help their coworkers who are in need, or they have a really big smile on their face as they're saying something really problematic, that's creating a mixed message there. And sometimes it makes it harder to address those problems when, well, they said that thing, but I saw on their face what they really meant. The words weren't the problem, but the way they said it, things like that. Wooden stick behaviors, those are those rigid behaviors. So when somebody is inflexible, stubborn, they can't adapt to change. Maybe there's new demands on the job and they refuse to follow that new policy because, man, the old way worked just fine. And again, this might sound small. We probably all have known coworkers in our careers that might have been rigid or had some of these behaviors, but they can build up, they can worsen, or become, again, that pattern that creates risk here. Escape artist behaviors, that's when people are avoiding dealing with their stress. They're avoiding responsibilities, maybe things that they don't want to do, don't like to do. They might even turn to addictions, substances to try to escape dealing with their emotions or their responsibilities. Shocker behaviors, I think you can probably all imagine what that looks like. This is the person who's trying to get a reaction, who does the big thing to see how people will react. They might violate norms in the workplace or violate work rules. And again, sometimes this goes without any sort of consequence. And then the stranger behaviors are when employees really isolate themselves. They might refuse to participate in team activities, refuse to engage with somebody, really be kind of closed off. Now, again, with all of this, we have to really think about the context in which all of this is happening and be aware of nuance. Not everybody's behavior means that there's a bigger issue, and some of it might be more the result of personal circumstance or cultural or personality differences or styles. So think of, maybe Beth really just needs some time to herself to decompress during the day. And so she doesn't have lunch with her coworkers, or she might keep her headphones on because, the activity around her is really distracting. So it could look isolating, but there's good reason for it. Or we could think of, George has a hard time dealing with change. So it might not actually be that he's rigid in all manners, but changes can come a little bit more difficult. So we're looking for patterns. So when the behaviors are consistent, extreme, or escalating, then this is when we want to pay closer attention and maybe even intervene. So we don't want to overlook warning signs or make excuses, say, oh, well, that's just Julie when she's upset, or, Sam just talks like that to everybody, so just let it go, no big deal. We want to pay attention to these things, but again, look at them in the broader context.
Absolutely. Let's look at the poll on what, okay, wow, look at there. So we've had some good results. So you guys are amazing. I gave you the answer there, but you all did very well on selecting all the right answers. Sarah, would you agree that this type of behavior, that all of these types of behaviors would be indicative of potential workplace violence?
Yes, absolutely. So one one category or one behavior is not more indicative than another. It's really, again, it's about how many of these behaviors are you seeing, how consistently, how extreme are they, and are they increasing in nature? So.
Absolutely. We did have some additional questions that have came in that I was going to get into and just kind of mention here while we're going through some of these before we get into the next section. But someone had mentioned, let's see, Michael had mentioned that they have a heavy homeless population near their facility, and so they definitely always have some concerns there for violence. I would assume then that the homeless population may struggle with some substance abuse issues there, as we had talked about before. So good points there. There was one talking about working between some interactions. There was an incident between various technicians. These are all great stories that I appreciate you guys sitting and talking us through. We'll definitely include some more as we continue to move through this. I do see all of your questions here. You guys are asking some good ones, especially about getting into some of the workplace violence bills, talking about what you can specifically do. And we are going to get to those very soon. So hold those questions and we're going to answer them very shortly. Dara, I'm going to come back to you and let you talk through the survey report that we had talked about.
Thanks, Holly. Just a quick note, if you refresh your browser, for those of you that were having issues with our next webinar sign up, you should be able to refresh and get access to that registration button now. So thank you everybody for your patience on that.
Ooh,
everything
awesome.
Should be good to go. Yeah, this survey report is interesting. So the objective of the survey was to understand the reality of how employees are experiencing workplace violence, misconduct, and mental health in the workplace. The method that they went about was to survey over 1,000 employees at companies that had more than 100 employees across the US. The area of focus for the study was where we can better protect organizations. And I know some of you out there are risk managers, so this is probably what keeps you up at night. How do we protect our organizations from those risks that are present? And especially as these new threats and concerns emerge, how do we think about that prevention of workplace violence and in a way that promotes employee safety and well-being? So let's dig into what they found. So what they found, 1 in 4 respondents have witnessed workplace violence either happening to another employee in the last 5 years, and 12% have been targets of violence themselves. So that's pretty staggering number there, that 1 in 4, so 25% have either observed or 12% have been targets themselves. 44% say that their employers promote a speak up culture. So that's where when I was referencing psychological safety, this concept of psychological safety has been around for a long time, but we're hearing about it, and it's definitely a current trend in the workplace, because if we're not promoting a culture of being able to raise your hand and promote and discuss concerns in a safe way, that we're missing ways to protect our company and our employees. So back to our risk managers and safety teams out there, promoting and building a culture where employees are able to speak up and not fear risk or not fear retaliation is really important. And then about 1/3 of respondents said they would only report an issue of misconduct or harassment if they could do so anonymously. And I recently had a friend and colleague talking to me about a similar situation of some major harassment within an organization. And my naive self said, report it to HR. And she said, that's the last thing I'm going to do, because I don't trust that HR is going to handle it in a way that doesn't threaten my career. And she felt like it would truly threaten her future career, not just at that company, but in her entire future as the profession she was in. And so I think that kind of shocked me. I guess I again kind of live in this Axiom bubble where we have a pretty great culture, if I do say so myself. And so I think I was surprised to hear how reluctant she was to go to either leadership or to HR to have a conversation about some major harassment she was dealing with. And so if only a third of respondents are willing to do this, and it would only do this if it was anonymous, that's really concerning. And 86% of those surveyed either strongly or somewhat agree that employers need to do more to address mental health needs of employees in the workplace. And so although that's discussing mental health specifically, all of that leads to environments of safety, and then on the flip side, environments that are ripe for workplace violence or other scenarios that are not safe or healthy for our workforces. So pretty staggering findings.
Absolutely. Well, Sarah, I'm going to come back to you now that we can jump into the case study here. Take us through what had occurred at this event.
Yeah, some of you might be familiar with this incident. It's a really tragic situation just a little over a year ago. On November 22nd, 2022, in Chesapeake, Virginia, 31-year-old named Andre Bing. He was a 12-year employee of Walmart. He was an overnight team leader, a manager. He walked into Walmart shortly after 10 p.m. He had a 9mm handgun, several magazines. He purchased them all legally. He walked back to the break room and he started shooting. Fortunately, he killed 6 employees of Walmart, all between the ages of 16 and 70 years old. Now, after he began opening fire, police received a call at 10:12 p.m. They arrived on scene 2 minutes later at 10:14. They first entered the store at 10:16, and at 11 p.m. they declared the scene safe. They confirmed that the shooter had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. About an hour or so later, ATF and FBI arrived to assist in the investigation. All of this, as many incidents like this occur, happened so rapidly and was over in less than 15 minutes. But in the aftermath, when they did the investigation, several employees described this shooter as condescending, mean, difficult, a bully, hostile. They said he would even fabricate reasons to write people up if he didn't like them or got upset. They also said that he often thought that the government was watching him. He would put a piece of black tape over the camera on his phone. He refused to participate in any pictures with his coworkers or videos that they would take. He was always concerned about being recorded or watched. And one time he even said that if he ever got fired from his job, he would retaliate and people would remember him.
Wow.
Now, unfortunately, because of all of this, this was actually reported allegedly to Walmart. About 2 months prior to the shooting, there was a complaint filed. And since the shooting, several lawsuits have come out, as Holly alluded to earlier, against Walmart for negligence, for hiring and continuing to employ this individual, despite their knowledge of his disturbing behaviors and interactions with coworkers and employees. The most recent lawsuit that still is in process is the one that Holly mentioned, that $50 million lawsuit. So not only is this a tragic event for all involved, but it's also an incredibly costly thing to not address these issues when concerns come to light.
Absolutely.
So some of the key concerns in this particular incident, of course, workplace safety, a huge one. The fact that someone was able to behave in the way that he did and then come into work with a weapon and carry out such violence in such a quick manner and take several lives. Mental health is particularly important, not only the mental health of the shooter, but the mental health of the individuals who experienced this tragic event. Now, I have to bring a bit of a caveat on talking about mental health in relation to workplace violence, because I think sometimes that gives the impression that people who have a mental illness are violent, or that, you know, violence and mental illness are closely aligned, particularly when we're talking about mass shooting situations. Now, the reality is that people with a mental illness are no more likely to become violent than people without a mental illness. But when we talk about mental health, we're not just talking about a diagnosable condition. We're talking about employees' resilience, their stress levels, their ability to problem solve, manage and regulate their emotions, and deal with things like interpersonal conflict in a healthy manner. So mental health isn't just about treating a condition, it's about a holistic approach to well-being. Couple of other things here that were really important: the ability to identify and respond to those potential threats, and the company's responsibility to address employee well-being and safety.
You know, I can't imagine, you know, just kind of putting yourself in that position. You wouldn't think that someone that's been with your organization for 12 years, you know, and they're in a leadership position, you would think that, you know, they're leading others, they're an example. But, you know, we had, I think it was Latoya Lee that had mentioned, she talked about creating a hostile work environment. And it sounds like from some of these reports that's what occurred, was that it became a hostile work environment. And especially with them working the night shift, Sarah, do you think that could have any impact, that maybe there's less oversight on the night shift than what there could be during the day? What are your thoughts there?
That's incredibly common. We don't necessarily know in this particular instance if that was the case or not, but absolutely that tends to happen in certain shifts. There's still supervision, but in this case, this was the supervisor. Right. So who's above that to see what's going on a day-to-day basis?
So kind of looking back then at some of the things that we've talked about that have been pointed out now, what are some of the things that jump out to you, Sarah, that could have been potential indicators before something like this had occurred?
Well, we see several things in this instance. He was harassing employees. He was, again, bullying. He was isolating himself in a lot of ways. He made a clear threat, and it may have been a tentative one of, if I get fired, and he wasn't fired, but if I get fired, I'm going to retaliate and people will remember me. That comment is a pretty distinct one, indicating that this would not be a small event, but something that would be, you know, that would gather a lot of attention. So, I mean, very clear statements from this one. Yeah,
I agree. Dara, anything you wanted to add to that? And anything that jumped out at you with that particular case?
No, I continue to put on my HR hat, and when I hear some of these comments about hostile work environment and some of those comments and threats, I think that a lot of our teams feel really helpless. And I think that even if this man's supervisor had resources or knew what to do, I think often we're in these scenarios and we don't know what to do or who to turn to, and so we don't do anything. And the risk of doing nothing is pretty significant. So I really empathize. I really feel for individuals within these organizations that may even have really great training on how to identify, and we'll talk about what to do and how to manage that, but may have really great training on how to identify or how to handle some of these scenarios. But it's really, really difficult. And I think unless, as an organization, you've agreed to take a systemic approach, and we'll talk a little bit about how to do that, but I think that individually leaving it up to somebody to make the correct call in these scenarios is really tough. And so I have a whole lot of empathy for those scenarios, because I don't know, even if we'd heard, it's easy to kind of go backwards and go, look at all these red flags and these things that happened. But in the moment of our day-to-day work life, when you've got kids and family to take care of and you're rushing to get home and whatever other 10 million things you have going on, to be able to stop and identify these things as a future threat when it's, and I know our risk managers and safety teams out there deal with this all the time, where how do you show how much you've prevented? How do you put value on the prevention? How do you put value on the ways within your organization that you've created systems to prevent injuries, to prevent violence, to prevent these situations from happening? It's really tough to show your boss, your CEO, your corporate board, all that work that you've put into place that's prevented some of these scenarios from happening, versus now Walmart being sued for not preventing this from being happened. And so it's much easier to go backwards and say, well, we should have prevented this, versus look at all the things we have prevented. So I again, not to defend Walmart in this scenario, but it is a very complex a situation that I really feel for everybody involved.
Absolutely. There's been a lot of questions, Dara, about what should they have done? What would you do with a comment like that? So let's talk through what other people are doing, what's coming, what's on the horizon, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to leave anybody feeling like just throw up your hands and walk away and give up, because I don't think just because it's complex doesn't mean we shouldn't do something. So there are some new workplace prevention laws coming into place. California is putting one into place in July of 2024. There are going to be requirements for those companies in the state of California that they will need to implement a workplace violence prevention plan, start logging violent incidents in the workplace. So just like all of you in safety log injuries, those within California are going to be required to log violent incidents in the workplace, and also provide annual training. And I think Sarah can talk a little bit about this. One of the things that Sarah, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, does is a lot of training for our team members and for client team members about how to handle some of these scenarios. And we'll dig into that a little bit. But I do always want to leave people with some action items and what we can do. But we are starting to see shifts in laws and requirements, and how that's starting. California's leading the charge there, and then we'll see how that shifts for other states and organizations across the U.S.
Absolutely. So Dara, when you see this, some were saying, do you think that people agree with this, that employees agree with this, which is perfect, because that leads us right back into the survey again. They specifically asked some of the individuals that took that and talked to us about what the findings were.
Yeah, this came from that same survey we were going through, the one that surveyed 1,000 plus employees. So within that survey, they are overwhelmingly supportive of states and companies adopting these new practices. So I think that's critical. Our employees are recognizing that things are potentially broken within some of our systems, and we're struggling. And so I think these are not things that if we put it in place are going to prevent everything, but it's a start. And I think that if we can start moving towards some new ways of handling some of these scenarios or putting some training in place, I do think what we've seen within organizations is the ability to identify and prevent some of these scenarios from occurring.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk through, both of you, kind of what it is that you could do right now. What are some actions that you can take? Sarah, do you want to start first? But I'd love to hear from both of you on this.
Sure. I think there are a lot of things that can be done. I also agree with Dara that sometimes it's about knowing when to do it and when not. And I think that's the hard thing. In this case, we only see what's in the news and in the court reports about what has occurred. Maybe they also had a lot of other context. Well, Andre was really going through a hard time, or they saw really positive things from him a lot of the time. And so, they're taking it in a different context of maybe there's a lot of mitigating factors that they saw that made them think this isn't as critical, or there may have been steps taken prior to this that we aren't aware of. But as far as what to do, if you're seeing these behaviors, I think the biggest thing is first to document what you know is happening, and then really rally your resources as much as you can. If your company has an employee assistance program, engage them for consultation. Those are mental health professionals that are at your access at no additional cost. It's already paid for by your company, so use it. That's a big one. There are also a lot of wonderful resources. The FBI has put a lot of resources out there about building policies on workplace violence and engaging and building a threat assessment team. I think that's a really critical thing for companies to have, and many don't. So having these things in place as a proactive measure is really the first step, so that when something happens, you already know where to go and what to do.
Yeah, I agree. Like I said, I always go back to HR. Look at your policies, look at your training. Sarah trains our organization on mental health first aid. A lot of our client organizations do mental health first aid training as well. It is phenomenal training. Again, it's not going to prevent everything, but it's going to help employees feel empowered in how to identify scenarios or weigh, like Sarah said, weigh scenarios, how to weigh the total picture of a human and what they're going through. And I think it doesn't mean that you have to be a manager only. It could be peer-to-peer. It could be manager to employee. But that type of training gives you the tools. And I think, again, the worst scenario would be to feel helpless in all of this, because it is overwhelming. And so if you start with looking at these resources, like Sarah's talked to some of your team, you've got a lot of resources out there that you might not even realize you have. And I know some of our audience members mentioned EAP. EAP is great in crisis, but they're also great to help potentially prevent crisis. So reach out to these individuals who are highly trained and great and phenomenal at helping train individuals and team members and talk about plans and how to manage that, mitigate those circumstances. Get yourself a Sarah on your team. I mean, having Sarah at Axiom and having some of those resources internally has been a total cultural game changer for Axiom, because those of you that have known us for a long time, we've historically managed physical injuries. That's our primary, that's what we do day in and day out. We have nurses, we manage physical injuries, we think about everything physical from a human perspective. But when you think about total worker health, and again, getting away from this duality of mind and body, we need to be addressing much more than the physical health of employees. And so that's been a primary mission for us, both for our own employees and for our client employees, because if we're missing that piece of the puzzle, then we're missing some great opportunities to help. And essentially that caring of employees is what we do. And that caring has to be both mental and physical. It is one thing. So get yourself a Sarah, get yourself resources, get that training in place, and it won't prevent everything from happening, but it'll step-by-step help you build culture to encourage those changes and encourage the reporting of situations when they do occur. I can tell you right now, not employee on employee violence, but we've had employees dealing with spousal abuse and various other horrific scenarios, and they feel very comfortable raising these issues internally and helping and asking for help from our teams because of what Sarah's done and what the team has done to build this kind of culture. So I know that sounds a bit like a commercial for what Axiom's done and who we are, but I do think it's made a difference. And I do think that when you ask our employees if it's made a difference, they would agree. And so these are some ways that you can make changes. There's other resources out there, like Sarah said, the FBI. We've got a lot of experts that we work with. If you need resources, we can point you in those directions, and we'll share some of that after the webinar. but I'll pass it back over to you, Holly, after my commercial is now complete.
No, I appreciate it. We've had so many questions that came in, so I want to get to a few of these while we still have some time. But also mention that we did get this fixed. So if you need to press on that register now, that RSVP, you definitely can do that. But we'll go back to some of the questions. Robert had just asked one about, does Axiom provide mental health first aid training? Yes, we do provide. Anything that you guys want to add there, we could definitely send you something, Robert, after the event. Lots of questions about, is this available? Is this going to be available after the event? Yes, this will be available within 24 hours. We'll send you a copy of that recording. One great question that was asked said, I've been trying to get my employer to get a cardinal rules of safety to expand our workplace violence prevention program, but they've been resistant. And so the question that I posed to both of you ladies is, how important do you think that piece is? And if you think that it's an important argument, what is it then? What is the argument that you might make to your board, to your leadership team, et cetera, to be able to bring in some of those resources and get some of those policies established?
I think the gist of the call or the conversation we've had today is, yes, it's important. And now getting buy-in, like I said, I think this is another area that I've said I have a lot of empathy. I think when you talk about placing value in prevention, it's really difficult. But I think if you start with some of these studies that we've shared, we'll share I think in your resources tab, you'll get access to the survey that we've been referencing. So I think data coming from somebody that has to do something similar, where I have to prove up value to my CEO and my board of directors, come with data and come with the stories behind it, because I do think that tugs at the emotions behind, if we don't do these things, here's what we're facing. Okay, the risk to our organization, if we don't put more stringent policy and practice in place, is pretty significant. Here's what it could be. And for every lawsuit that you're preventing, for every loss of life that you're preventing, you can put, I mean, as cold-hearted as it is, you can put real dollars behind all of that. And yes. I think these surveys and these resources can help you do that.
Absolutely. Sarah, another question that we had, and I'll come to you on this one. It was, she'd said, I was going to do a report on something that had occurred with workplace violence, but she's struggling to get anyone to give them a statement of those that had seen it. So in that type of scenario, is that where you would rely on kind of building that psychological safety, or what kind of recommendations would you provide for that?
Psychological safety is huge. It's important. If Dara, you had a great example of that. Somebody saying HR is the last place that I would go. It's so important to have a solid leadership team and people in those roles who have the ability and authority to act, who also are approachable and recognize the importance of these situations. You know, we can place responsibility in a lot of places. It's important for people to report these things, but they also have to have a safe and responsive place to report to. So I think that building that culture is really the biggest thing in facilitating that.
Sarah, I'm going to ask you one more, come to you on this one. Jen was asking, if someone exhibits signs of mental health issues, but some align with the red flags, how can we determine if they're due to mental health or whether it's actually a warning sign of workplace violence? That's an excellent question and hard to answer, I'm sure.
It's a great question, but I think the hopefully easy answer that gets you off the hook a little bit is, you don't have to identify whether it's a mental health issue or not. If you're seeing those patterns of behavior that, again, are consistent, extreme, or escalating, that's an issue regardless of whether it's driven by a mental health condition or medical condition or anything else. It's still an issue that needs to be addressed. And so that's when you want to rally your team. So HR, your employee assistance program, the management consultants there, potentially even legal, security, so that you have all those experts at your disposal to figure out together what the appropriate course of action is.
Dara, we've got one more minute, and we had several questions. Linda was specific one, specifically had asked, what should they have done in that scenario? So the question was, in the Walmart case where you had that had occurred, what should they have done maybe prior to that event happening once they got a report? What, from an HR
Well, like I said, it's always easier to go backwards and see it from a rear view mirror. But number one, the culture obviously didn't lend itself for various reasons to people feeling comfortable. They said that there was a report, but we don't know enough of the details to kind of judge how that went. But I do think creating the culture of, see something, say something. And I know a lot of you in the safety world do that from a physical barrier standpoint, or if you see something that's unsafe. But I do think having good policy in place, having training, if the team had had training around the mental health first aid scenarios or other types of training and recognized it, if the supervisor had had that kind of training, maybe they could have recognized the patterns of behavior that were concerning. And like Sarah said, it's not that they have to diagnose this man with anything. Nobody needs to take that on themselves, but it's the ability to recognize patterns. As an HR person, we trained that you need to recognize behavior patterns and be able to escalate immediately when there's a concerning behavior pattern.
100%. LaToya Lee said one more last thing, and I thought this was really impactful. She said, as a 911 dispatcher, we have to take conflict resolution and escalation and peer support training. And so she was saying, following some of the cases that they've had to deal with, that they are offered grief counseling with other support being offered. And I think that that's an excellent point. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because many times that's the part that gets left behind, is that we have the situation, but we don't know how to come back in and take care of the other employees that may not have been involved directly in that occurrence, but there's others that have questions and they have concerns. So that's an excellent point. Well, guys, thank you so much. We are at the end of time here. If we didn't get to your question, we will reach out to you directly. I appreciate all of the many emojis that you've sent, all of the questions. We're going to follow up, and we'll have some great gifts that are coming your way. Again, we always appreciate your input, and we hope to see you this next month on the one where we talk about cannabis and the new norms. Have a great day.